This video is about tandem budgeting and the policy constraint. It's a practical demonstration using patient created in previous videos of how service amounts are allocated to policy components as they are created. We're doing this so you can understand the rules that the budgeting engine is using to determine if a patient has coverage or not for a service type group or service type group combo. This video uses an example of a patient that was created in an earlier video and terminology explained in previous videos. If you haven't watched those videos, you definitely should. If you don't, you'll get much less value out of watching this one, and your time will not be well spent. We're logged into Coligo and in location Cassini. We've searched for our example patient, Paige Davis, and are looking at the policy summary for the policies we created previously. The policy for self has policy components ordered prior to those for the spouse policy. We expect service charges for chiropractic assessment and massage to be allocated to the self policy before the spouse policy. The start accumulate YMD value for the chiropractic assessment of the self policy is set to March 1 of 2011. When we create a service, we should expect to see an allocation of service amounts to this policy component if the service occurs on or after March 1. If it occurs prior to March 1, this policy component will not soak up any of the service charge. We also expect that only 80% of the service amount will be covered by the first two policy components to a dollar limit specified in the amount limit per year for each component respectively. We're starting off with a utilization total of 0 for each component. Okay, so let's start demonstrating use cases. The simplest first, and we'll change policy components around as we go to demonstrate how the budgeting engine works. We're going to head over to the scheduler to create services. We're going to start by clicking on June 14. We need a chiropractor for the first example and likely a kinesiologist and physiotherapist for future examples, so let's set them up. There are many providers in Cassini because it's used as a training ground. We'll have to hide a few providers that we don't need for teaching examples. We do that with the hide icon in the upper left corner of each column header. Can get rid of the other providers we don't need. Looks like we lost the massage therapist. We'll just bring them back. Kinesiologist, massage therapist, physiotherapist, and the chiropractor. So next we'll create a booking for Paige with the chiropractor because the first policy components we want to test are the ones for the chiropractic assessment. We see from the booking that there is no short list of service types for this patient. The patient is new, so we didn't expect that there would be one. We'll add a service type now to the patient's short list, a chiropractic initial extended assessment. We'll pick this because we're demonstrating a policy component for the chiropractic assessment service type group, and this service type is a member of that group. You can see that there are service provider first and last initials for the providers that have billing privileges at Cassini. We're looking for SM for Simon Monjack. We see that there is an MS for Mahmoud, the physiotherapist, but no SM, which likely means that Simon has no billing privileges at Cassini. We can change this by altering Simon's provider profile. We'll go back to Coligo Home in the other tab, head over to the menu, work with the service provider tool, search for MONJ, it's a partial name, search for service provider, select him and go to the service locations that are assigned to this provider. There's only one, and that's Cassini, and we see that indeed the billing setting is set to N. We'll change that to a Y, and now we expect to see his first and last initials in the booking when we open it again. And there it is. So let's click that and create the service using SM as the biller. And we see that the service was created for $130. Service provider, the biller, is Monjack. Returning to Call Go Home and searching for page and selecting again, we expect some changes to the policy utilization. We expect 80% of the service amount of $130 to be captured by the first chiropractic assessment policy component and the remainder by the next assessment policy component. And there it is. 80% of 130 is $104, and the remainder of $26 is captured by the chiro assessment policy component of the other policy. The next test is what happens with services billed prior to the start accumulate YMD of the first policy component. Let's create a service for this policy component in February prior to the start accumulate YMD for the first chiro assessment policy component. We see that we are not hindered from creating the service. This is because the YMD start of the budget is the beginning of the calendar year, and February is definitely after the beginning of the calendar year. When we consult the utilization again, after creating that service, we see that the $104 of utilization in the first policy component is unchanged. The utilization of the second assessment policy component, however, has captured the entire charge of the February service, which is $130. There is no YMD start accumulate for the chiro assessment policy component of the spouse policy. In this next test, we'll get rid of the February service by deleting it. And this should change the utilization numbers. And it does. They are changed to the amounts prior to the creation of the February service. Let's go to the policy and change the amount coverage for the first policy to $100. The budget engine recalculates, and we see that the amount used by the first policy is $100, the limit for that component. The amount utilized is also highlighted with a green background to indicate that it is exhausted. The $4 that used to be captured by the first component is now captured by the second for a total of $30, previously $26. Now, this isn't typical of the way that policies are used in real life. So let's make it a little more realistic and say that the spouse policy covers 20% of what's thrown at it. We change the 100 to a 20 and update. We notice immediately after the update and the recalculation of utilization that $4 of the 130 is now not covered. Once again, we're back to $26 utilized by the second policy component. So in this situation, what do we do about the $4 not covered? There are options, and the one that you choose will depend on what the policy is at your location regarding amounts not covered. You could lower your service charge for the service rendered. You could leave things as they are. You could leave things as they are and write off the amount on the invoice. Or maybe you don't like to see things in the service balance not covered section of your policy summary. If that's the case, you can create another policy to soak up the amounts that are not addressed by the other policies. I convention you might consider using is the creation of a patient portion policy. We'll create one here, name it patient portion. It's a health plan of single variety. We can set the holder to the current patient and add service type group for chiropractic assessment. We want all leftover charges to be captured in this one, so we leave things unlimited. When we save, we see the ordinate is default to 0. We change that to 30 so it will sort last and soak up dollars after the other policy components. When we update, we can see that it did soak up the unaddressed $4. So that's a pretty fair accounting of money that might have to be written off or addressed somehow with the patient. The next situation we need to demonstrate is when there is no budget for a service type. That is, the charge is not covered by any policy component because all the ones that could have addressed it have been exhausted and we tried to bill another service. We'll change the amount limit on the patient portion to something really low so we know we're definitely out of coverage. We see that the service balance not covered section comes up again with a $2 amount not covered. So what does our booking look like now? There is a red indicator, unbudgeted, and the last first initials of the billers are now not available for you to create a service of this service type. So that's it for this video. I ran through much of the logic that governs the behavior of policies and the policy constraint. Be sure to watch the other videos about parallel logic and its interaction with the policy constraint.